Hello and welcome to Hot Pursuit, part of Ahval video and podcast series. Today, we will discuss an escalating conflict in Libya and Eastern Mediterranean in general, with the Turkish government at its epicenter, a conflict now threatening to turn into a large-scale confrontation involving Egypt, Greece, France, Russia, the USA, and even perhaps Israel. In the background, also what many observers see as expansionism or irredentism of Ankara following Syria, also seen by the most recent military operations into Iraqi Kurdistan. On the seas, the subject of blue homeland, a doctrine designed by some hawkish Turkish officers, bringing to the fore dormant Greek-Turkish conflicts. In the context, we also hope to touch on the fresh book by John Bolton, the former national security advisor to Trump. Our guests are two most prominent Turkey and MENA analysts. Stephen Cook is a senior fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome, Stephen.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Yalis.
Thank you. And Henri Barki is also a senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he's also teaching international relations at Lehigh University. Hello, Henri.
Hi, how are you?
And I am also joined by Ilhan Taner, executive editor of Ahval English, to help me ask questions. Good to see you, Ilhan.
Good to see you. Thank you.
And let's begin with Stephen. You have been tweeting a couple of things about Libya. We will focus on Libya at the initial phases of this conversation. You said, wrote actually, rather than Libyan conflict ending, it seems to be entering a new phase. Now we know what's at stake, which actors are involved, and it's been like boiling milk, if you will. Now seems to have come to the tipping point, perhaps. Which phase are you talking about?
Well, it is extraordinary how much actual saber rattling is going on right now among the actors in Libya. The Russians just a week or so ago deployed more aircraft to eastern Libya. The fact that President Erdogan has vowed to help the Government of National Accord, the internationally recognized government of Libya, to retake Sirte, has gained the attention of the Egyptians. Now, for Egypt, Libya is its backyard. It's like for Americans, Mexico. And the idea that Turkey and President Erdogan would have a presence in Libya, in Egypt's backyard, is deeply unnerving for the Egyptian government. And at first we saw the commanders of the western region of Egypt getting together to discuss plans. And then we also saw a number of days later video of President Abdel Fattah Sisi inspecting troops along the almost 900-mile border between Egypt and Libya, with large numbers of main battle tanks and aircraft in the area. The question is whether the Egyptians are going to allow the Turks to essentially set up shop in Libya. Turkey is a government that has welcomed in the Muslim Brotherhood, allowed the Muslim Brotherhood and other oppositionists to set up media in Turkey to delegitimize the Sisi government. The Egyptians believe that the Turks have been fomenting extremism around the region, including in the Sinai Peninsula. I think the Turks have much to answer for, at least in the Syria conflict. I think that the Egyptian allegations with regard to Sinai aren't accurate. But nevertheless, there is this perception in Cairo that the Turks are encroaching on Egypt's, for lack of a better term, sphere of influence. And even if both the Turkish government and the Egyptian governments are just beating their chests, there is a whole host of ways in which they could fall into conflict by miscalculation and error. Last point, Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi said on the second day of the Libyan revolution on Libyan television, he warned Libyans that Libya was not like Egypt and it was not like Tunisia, and that Libyans would fight each other for the next 40 years. and they are getting a lot of help from Turks, Egyptians, Emiratis, French, Russians, Qataris, and others uh, in this fight that is fragmenting the country and fragmenting it over again. Let's just hope that everybody's bluffing.
Do you expect war? I mean, with the Egypt now entering into the stage, we are talking about, if the data is correct, the 9th largest army in the world. Turkish army is 11th. Do you expect war? And if so, what happens if
it's very hard to predict, Yavuz. Of course, you know, it is, as I said, there's a whole host of ways in which, by miscalculation, the two countries can find themselves in conflict, and that would be pose a number of dilemmas for NATO, for the United States. What I do know is that for all of the kind of weaknesses of the Egyptian armed forces, they can mobilize large numbers of people, and Libya is adjacent to Egypt. Turkey has proven that it has a lot of military capacity. Look at what it did a number of months ago in Syria. Look at what it's done in Libya. But it's also far away from home and would be confronting significant forces from the Egyptians. I do think that there is reason to be worried. I had spoken with Libyan friends who believe that the Egyptians are bluffing. It's true the Egyptians have not deployed their own forces outside of Egyptian borders in a very, very long time, other than in a peacekeeping mission. But again, Libya is Egypt's backyard, and Turkey makes Egypt very, very nervous, given the history between these two governments, and in particular, given the history between these two leaders, Abdel Fattah Sisi and the way he came to power, and how President Erdogan has sought to delegitimize the Egyptian government. It's something that I think we should all be worried about. And I've noticed some European diplomacy, but kind of very little in the way of U.S. diplomacy, which is striking because Turkey is a NATO ally of the United States still, despite the differences between the two countries, and Egypt is a strategic partner of the United States. I would be worried. As I said, I have Libyan friends who don't seem to think that they've essentially dismissed this possibility. I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand at all.
Before I hand the questions to Ilhan, I have a question for Henri. Henri, even if we hadn't had any COVID-19 pandemic, which was also one of the main factors for international apathy, if you will, and indifference for what's happening in East Med and Libya. We also now hear many people questioning whether or not the US administration, the current one, has had or has any Libya policy at all. And if so, how much of it is to be blamed on in this escalating conflict?
To be blamed on whom? Let me put it this way. I don't know if there is a Libya policy of the United States. I mean, you get the sense that different parts of the administration and the bureaucracy are acting or have their own, maybe their agenda, but A, it's not a priority, clearly. B, I don't think they have pulled their weight so much that I don't think they are in a position to play a decisive role. I mean, the United States has no presence there, has not indicated any preferences, except there are some reports today that there was a meeting between the current internationally recognized prime minister and the American ambassador to Libya and American military officials. But I don't really know what all this amounts to. Besides, it's also not clear to me that if the United States were to say anything at this stage, that anybody would listen to the United States. The United States has essentially lost all its, shall we say, visible power, soft and hard, and actors in the region will do whatever they want and really not care what Washington has to say. So even if the United States had a policy today, I don't think it matters, right? So we also don't have any kind of transparency at the moment. I mean, you hear reports that President Erdogan and President Trump in their phone conversation the other day agreed on Libya. What does that mean? Right? We don't have any. This is an administration like no other the United States has seen. So it's also a little bit difficult to read the tea leaves.
If this is the Libyan conflict is about fighting jihadists and also expansion of political Islam on that ground, if it is so, many things are puzzling. Like, where do the Americans stand? Where do the Russians stand? Where do French stand? Etc. Etc. If it is not, and if it's about turf war with the oil and energy resources at the center, it's another story. But how do you read into that?
Well, I actually think I don't know whether you would call it a turf war. I mean, I don't think this is about expanding jihadist influence. I mean, the Turks are not trying to start a jihadist movement in Northern Africa. That said, the kind of people they bring to the scene from Syria are all Islamists who, at some point or another, as we've seen in other conflicts, will start moving away, will defect, or will try to move maybe to go to Europe. And from that perspective, this is what the French are so upset, is that potentially you have 10, 12, 13,000 jihadist Syrians in Libya who potentially may start moving into Europe at a time when the Europeans have already had an enormous amount of trouble fighting ISIS and the likes on European soil. But to me, this really is more about Erdogan trying to prove that he is the master of the region. I mean, he's pushing in Syria, he's pushing in Iraq, he's pushing in the Eastern Med, he's pushing in the Aegean, and Libya is very much part of that strategy. And remember that the Libyan government, the Sarraj government, and Turkey signed this deal delineating an exclusive economic zone, which in a way technically allows the Turks from stopping any type of pipeline construction between Eastern Med, the Cyprus, Egyptian, Israeli gas finds, and Europe. It's also technically they can even stop LNG tankers if they want to. I mean, this is all about Turkey trying to show that it is a power. I mean, it is part of Erdogan's both foreign and domestic policy, and he always wanted to make Turkey into some kind of a consequential international power. I mean, he's been saying that from the moment he walked into office, except that he could not do it initially the way he wanted to do it, and he has eventually shifted. Now, the important thing to remember here is that the Turks have actually built a considerable amount of military power. I mean, what they've done, the integration that they've done between drones and their air force is actually very, very impressive. I mean, they've shown that they can use drones and they can use aircraft to control the drones in a way that we've seen in Libya, we've seen in Syria. I'm not sure exactly how effective it's been in Iraq yet, but nonetheless, there's that kind of technology. Plus, the Turks have invested a great deal on their navy. They're going to launch very soon the Anadolu, which is a small aircraft carrier. So the Turks are showing that they can actually control the Mediterranean, that they are the most important naval power in the Eastern Mediterranean for sure. So that's what I see as what's going on.
Mm-hmm. About just in passing, about 1/4 to 1/3 of the Turkish Navy at this moment seems to be engaged in offshore Libya, East Mediterranean naval drills, etc., etc. Ilhan, floor is yours. I mean, maybe we should continue with Stephen. Whatever questions you may have.
I'd like to move to Syria, if I may. It looks like Turkey continues to expand its zones of influence in Syria. I think we'll say 4 different parts. I'd like to get your take on, Stephen, if I may, about the U.S., how the U.S. looks at Turkish expansion, whether in northern Syria, northeastern Syria, as well as Idlib, and whether we can say that the currently U.S. is supporting Turkish expansion against whether Assad regime with this recent Caesar, or against the Russian expansion. How does it look from Washington?
Thanks for the question. I just want to pick up on one thing that Henri said and expand it a little bit. The fact that the Turkish Navy is so active is actually spurring a effort on the part of other actors in the Eastern Mediterranean to build up their own naval presences. The Egyptians have just signed an agreement to purchase a number of naval vessels from Italy. The Israelis are active in this area as well, but I think the most active actor in the buildup of naval forces in the Eastern Mediterranean at this point has been the Egyptians. And again, it feeds into this concern about what Turkey's intentions are, both in Egypt's front yard and its backyard. On this question of Syria, my sense is that the administration, through a combination of the president having a relatively short attention span for different issues, has essentially allowed the Turks to expand and reinforce their presence throughout Syria, seeing that it's better that Turkey be there than the United States be there, which is perfectly in line with the president's worldview, and that they see some benefit of the Turkish presence there because it puts pressure on the Assad regime. The administration's position has long been that the United States does not want to engage in any kind of military effort to overthrow the Assad regime, but through sanctions and denying the ability of the Assad regime to rebuild the country and therefore spread money around to its supporters, create economic problems for Bashar al-Assad. The combination of those two things, I think, are putting significant pressure on the Assad regime. And there are broader issues at work here, however, that are more complicated than just the Assad regime and apparent U.S.-Turkey cooperation on it. And that is the relationship between Turkey and Iran and Turkey and Russia. And that is much more complicated and not as clear cut. And those in Washington who have continued to make the case that Turkey can be a strategic ally have pointed out that their belief that Turkey can be an important partner in countering Iran and Russia around the region. And they point to Turkey being on opposite sides. Let's take Russia in Syria, or Turkey being on opposite sides of Russia in Libya. But it's been interesting to see how Erdogan and Putin have compartmentalized those differences, have tried to work through them one-on-one and through diplomacy. I think because both those actors don't want a broader role for the United States in these conflicts. And then on Iran, I just think, clearly, the Turks have handled the Iranians carefully. They have been very clear about what their interests are in Syria and have not been shy about taking to the Iranians at certain points. But again, and I know you want to talk about it in a bit, that clearly the Turkish government, figures at the highest level of the Turkish government, have been willing to assist the Iranians in evading sanctions and in Iran's pursuit of its aggressive foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
Andre, may I follow up the same subject on Syria and add with this? How do you see this end game? How long do you think the Turkey is going to stay in Syria, or whether you'll see any kind of exit strategy for Turkey to get out, or it's going to be another Cyprus issue and Turkey will stay there forever?
Now, so I think we should separate what Turkish intentions are and what the reality will be. By that, what I mean is that I think that if Joe Biden were to win the presidency in this country, you will probably see a major change in policy. At least there will be some kind of policy emerge, not just for Libya, but the Middle East in general, and these kinds of what the Turks have been doing. So the Turks essentially, what they really want to do is to create a buffer zone on the Syrian side of the Turkish border and kind of de-Kurdify that region, essentially really get rid of all the Kurds. Now they've done it in certain parts of northern Syria, but clearly they have not done it everywhere. Now they haven't done it everywhere because there are still American troops in northeastern Syria. There's still the Kurds and the Americans are working together in fighting ISIS. And the Pentagon does not want to pull those troops out, even though the president of the United States would like to do that. So again, I want to go back to feed into what Stephen said. At this stage, I don't think that anybody thinks that the United States has any say on what's happening in Syria. Yes, we introduced the Caesar Act, and the Caesar Act is going to make things much more difficult for the Bashar al-Assad regime. What is to me very interesting, and I'm curious why Stephen thinks that the two countries, Turkey and Russia, care most about not letting the United States back into Syria, when I think the United States, at least at this point in time, has no intention of going into Syria because Trump doesn't want to. He wants to get out. Now, if it is a policy designed for the post-Trump presidency, that actually really makes sense. But there is something I've been thinking and questioning a little bit, is look at it from the Russian perspective, or Putin's perspective. Putin was defeated essentially in Libya by the Turks, and also to a large extent in Syria. So why should Putin allow essentially a second-rate power, which Turkey is compared to Putin's view of his own position in the world? Why would he allow a second-rate country to defeat him? So what I'm curious is whether
you
or
are
not
pretty certain about the defeat, but the Russians are still there.
But look what happened in first of all in Libya. The Haftar government has been defeated, despite the fact that the Russian Wagner troops were involved, with all the support that the Russians had given Haftar. Right, so that's a huge defeat in my view. I mean, and defeat to Turkish technology, as I mentioned earlier, the drones, etc. In Idlib, that the Turks have essentially stopped the Syrians from taking Idlib, right? And the last thing, if you forget the Kurdish areas of Syria for a moment, the thing that stands between Assad controlling Syria is Idlib, and the Turks have essentially said, no, you can't go in here. Now, what of course is interesting is that the Russians have shown that they can actually make the Turks pay a price. I mean, remember a few months ago, 36 Turkish soldiers were killed by a Russian air raid, right? Which they said was really Syrian, but it was actually Russian, right? So, and there is the Turks cannot operate in the air over northern Syria, over Idlib, without the permission of the Russians. So the Russians do have means to fight to push back on the Turks. They haven't used it yet, and to me, that's really a question mark as to whether or not at some point Putin will say to Erdogan, you've gone too far. I'm putting this out as a question. I don't know the answer, and I'm curious what Stephen thinks about this. But,
yes.
This is something that's been bugging me a little bit.
Just quickly, my only point about the Turks and the Russians not really wanting the United States around and involved in either Syria or Libya is a function, I think, of where there is a strong confluence of interest between Ankara and Moscow, which is that neither like the idea of an American-led order in the region and see themselves as the countries that are going to ultimately provide the order for the region. At some point, they will come into greater conflict, but at least now, Erdogan doesn't see the United States as a country that enhances Turkey's power, and obviously the Russians are interested in sowing confusion and mistrust within the West in order to weaken the United States. I think one other wrinkle to what Henri was saying, was very interesting to see how the Russians seemed to back off when the Turks undertook operations after those 33 Turkish soldiers were killed. And as I said in my opening remark, the Turks have proven that they have a lot of military capacity and have used it in innovative ways. I will point out that everybody in the world knows that those 33 Turkish soldiers were killed by Russian fire. And the Turks did not go after the Russians. They went after the Syrians and Iranian-backed regime. So there is, as I said, these two countries that are looking at each other warily, have certain confluence of interests, don't want to necessarily get into conflict. Let's see what happens in Libya now that the Russians have deployed a significant amount of air power there. But you do have to give the advantage to the Turks with a high-tech NATO military. They have proven themselves capable when no one really thought that they would be.
Mm-hmm.
But here, let me just introduce one thing. We've seen these reports about the UN recognized Libyan government of Sarraj making moves, trying to take over Misrata and Sirte. I don't think the Russians will allow that, right? Because
nor the Egyptians,
right?
At least they said that's what they say.
That's right. But but the Russians have the air power there, right? And also, I don't know if the Russians would like the idea of the Turks building bases, an air base and a naval base in Libya. So it's quite possible that should Libyan forces, the GNA forces, start to move towards Misrata and Sirte, that suddenly the Russian aircraft will come into play and try to stop them. And that will create lots of casualties, will involve some of the jihadists that the Turks have brought in. So that will make, but this is essentially a decision that Erdogan will make in Ankara as to whether or not the Libyan forces will advance eastward, right? If he makes that decision, then I think all hell's going to break loose.
Well, this is the possibility that I'm talking about, and the fact that even with Turkey proving itself to be a sophisticated and innovative military power, with the Russian aircraft there, Egypt has the fourth largest inventory in the world of F-16s. No one has claimed that they use them effectively or efficiently, but that you could bring a lot of power to bear there. And then let's not forget the Emiratis, who are have a skilled air force as well. So you really could have a very significant conflict there, which is why it strikes me that the Germans, the Italians have been quite vocal in trying to restrain all the sides here.
Also the French.
The French have mostly been critical of Erdogan.
Yes. I am interested in hearing both of your views about, again, in the same context, the so-called Blue Homeland doctrine, which, of course, Erdogan government does everything in its power to legitimize because it's been and based on an agreement with the UN-backed Sarraj government, and this, of course, stirred a lot of ground, and the air is polluted now, involving Cyprus, Greece, etc., etc. And this has been a design and choreography by some hawkish Turkish naval officers, but it's been approved by the palace, and it is now, as we speak, in implementation. How do you assess the future of this Blue Homeland and what consequences and repercussions it may cause in the East Med? Henri?
Well, Henri wrote about it recently.
So Look, I think the blue homeland strategy is a replacement for Erdogan's original thinking about the Middle East, which was that the Turks would create some kind of hegemony over the Middle East because Turkey was the most powerful military power, the most internationally recognized country, was an Islamic country, was part of the was on the doors of the European Union and member of NATO. But there was enormous amount of pushback from the Arab countries saying, no, we don't need another hegemon. And of course, with the advent of the Arab Spring, all that strategy collapsed. So, but as I said earlier, Erdogan from the beginning wanted to essentially show that Turkey is a big power. I mean, you remember he keeps talking about that the UN Security Council is bigger than five, and he keeps going like this, meaning that somehow maybe Turkey should become a permanent member. He also says it's unfair that to become a member of the UN Security Council you have to be a nuclear power, and so on and so forth. So he has these huge ambitions for himself, which these ambitions are both kind of personal for himself and for Turkey, but also play exceedingly well at home in Turkey, because all you have to do is look at the Turkish press and look at the rhetoric coming out of various sources in Turkey. Everybody seems to support this this policy, because finally Turkey is pushing back on the Europeans, or pushing back on the United States, pushing back on the Greeks, and all these people, all these countries that the Turks have never really liked very much. And so I think the blue homeland doctrine is real. We are only seeing the beginning of it. And as I said, Turkey has invested a great deal in its navy. And remember, both the drone program, which we know now is exceedingly successful, and the naval program all started more than a decade ago. I mean, you don't create a navy overnight, right? So there's been a great deal of planning in Turkey over the last decade in terms of building capacity. Now, there are some problems that the Turks face. I mean, they made certain mistakes. I mean, the S-400 question is problematic for them, because now they're out of the F-35 program. So there are complications. And again, it all depends on who wins the elections in the United States. What it seems to me also is what Erdogan is trying to do is trying to maximize his gains as long as Trump is there, because clearly Trump has given him an opening, or has opened the door wide to doing whatever he wants, right? So everything that from again, as Stephen said, well, maybe we'll talk about Halkbank later, but everything that Trump does is being perceived in Turkey as, oh, you can go ahead and do what you want. So the blue homeland, which is a much larger strategy, you will see now that Turkish ships may actually start looking for gas in the Eastern Mediterranean, and try to push out the others. So you may see confrontations in the seas, and it will be very interesting if that happens, what the United States will do. But as long as Erdogan is there, expect that the blue homeland doctrine to remain and to expand.
I have one tiny question to you before I move to Stephen, and then I will let Ilhan ask about Bolton's book. But Henri, the source of mine, a friend of mine, an academician, a curious one actually, he said, actually there's a convergence between the Islamist Ahmet Davutoğlu's book, Strategic Depth, and the Blue Homeland Doctrine. And it seems like the second one, the latter, is a continuity of that book. Have you ever thought about that?
Yeah, no, I always thought that, look, the initial strategy of Turkey was this zero problems with the neighbors, which was the way they were going to establish their hegemony over the Middle East. And that was Davutoğlu's thinking. I mean, I think Davutoğlu and Erdogan, from that perspective, come from the same background. I mean, they do see Turkey as a major power that has not been given its due, right? And this is all about getting its due, right? So in that sense, I completely agree with you and your friend that Davutoğlu and Erdogan on the same wavelength. That said, I don't think Davutoglu would necessarily take the kind of risks that Erdogan has taken so far. Now, Erdogan has paid off for Erdogan, but we still are at the beginning of the game. We still, as Stephen also was talking about the Egyptian reaction, react to all of this. I mean, it doesn't necessarily, because the Egyptians haven't done anything now, the Russians haven't done anything now, that doesn't mean that they will not do something tomorrow or 3 months from now, right? And they may be preparing something. I mean, so yes, the Turks have achieved a great deal now, but I would say we have to wait a little bit before to ascertain whether or not this is will be consolidated.
I guess much will depend on who wins the American elections in November. But Stephen, let's put it in a broader historic context before I move the questions to be asked to Ilan. Some friends of mine, Arabic, secular and nationalist Arabic sources, are pointing out that 2023 will be the centennial 100th anniversary of Turkish Republic. And they point out that these remnant years until 2023, we will see more and more, as they say, to Turkish expansionism. Move in just to stay there and expand. And this is somewhat linked, of course, to what we have learned from 1930s, the immense disgruntlement of Versailles Treaty among the Germans. Led to the hellish 1930s in Germany, and also now, as they point out, there's all these blue homeland, these kind of moves into Libya, etc., point out to a disgruntlement actually, although it's not spoken about so much, with Lausanne Treaty, basically, is it a correct? Expressed concern of these Arabic sources that we will see a sort of the same repetition of history in a Turkish way, let's say.
Well, I think there's something to that. Look, the Justice and Development Party and Turkish Islamists have been, hostile to the Republic and believe that it's a somewhat of an accident of history, and have tried to undermine certain institutions of the Republic and things that led to the institutionalization of the Republic in a variety of ways. I think that Erdogan is driven on the foreign policy front not so much by, I think the Lausanne Treaty is a useful rhetorical device, but I think what he's most interested in, and let's just set aside that from the Turkish perspective, if you are a strategic planner, there is good strategic reason for you want to have an exclusive economic zone with Libya. There is good reason for you sitting in Ankara to look at Blue Homeland as something that's important from a strategic perspective, given the burgeoning relationships between Israel, Cyprus, Greece, Egypt, an Emirati and Saudi component to those things as well. But I think that overall, what I think Arabs who are looking at this are picking up on is that in 2023, Erdogan also has an election, and that a leadership role for Turkey in the region, one that is muscular, aggressive, and ordering the region, plays well for Erdogan, who has otherwise been weakened as a result of economic missteps and a variety of other problems that are confronting him at home. So I think that there's both a kind of ideological component that's at work here, a strategic component, and certainly Erdogan's politics. If you're presiding over an economy that is in profound trouble, if you are presiding over a society where larger numbers of people are growing weary of your worldview and your party's worldview, especially since it's really come down to just another form of authoritarianism, it's easy to play on the kind of nationalist sentiments that many Turks, whether they're supporters of the Justice and Development Party or not, feel. given a kind of history and the reservoir of mistrust of foreigners and countries around them and of the United States and others. So I think that's really what's going on here. To make these kind of parallels to the 1930s in Europe is straining a bit. But I that's what I think is the motivation here.
Okay, we are slightly running out of time, Ilhan, but we have, I think, space for 2 or 3 questions about Bolton's book and Halkbank, as Henri mentioned, etc., because those are also linked with the things that we are talking about.
For the time, I'll just ask my 2 questions together on both of them from the book. So throughout the book, we see that according to Bolton's account, the President of the United States is in his relationship between with Ukraine, China, and Turkey, 3 countries look like. We do see that what the Trump expects from China or Ukraine, but I do not see what is it that he expects from Turkey while giving all this, whether halting sanctions, whether helping on the Halkbank, or giving green light to Syrian Northeast. What's it that he gets in return? And the second question on the same book again, about Halkbank. What is your view on the account of Mr. Bolton on the Halkbank, whether on the phone calls or face-to-face meetings? We see that Mr. Erdogan, the first item he brings to the table and discusses for maybe half of the meetings is either Halkbank, Rıza Zarrab, or Mehmet Hakan Atilla halting the sanctions. How do you see that? And do you think, looking at what happened to the South District of New York now, do you see any tie to Turkish request, or it is something else?
Who starts?
Whoever wants. Andre, would you like to start?
Let me look. To me, it's also a puzzle. I don't know what Trump expects to get from Erdogan.
To Bolton, also, it's also a puzzle. It seems in the latest interview with, was it NBC or ABC? He's asked that question. He says, "I don't know." Basically, he doesn't know.
So I don't. I mean, it may just be that Trump likes for regional strongmen to take care of the region, and so that the United States doesn't have to get involved. So you deal with Syria, you deal with the Kurds, you deal with that. Maybe. As for, I would say, for Halkbank, look, the reason Erdogan raises this issue over and over again, my guess is because if sanctions were to be imposed on Turkey as a result of this, right, that especially at the time when the Turkish economy is exceedingly weak, would be devastating, right? So far, he has been successful in convincing Trump not to impose the sanctions. But again, what he really would like to do is for that provision to somehow completely disappear, right? Because again, Erdogan is thinking, well, what happens if the Democrats win the White House, maybe even the Senate? Then they will essentially say, okay, go ahead, because that's the only thing that has stopped the sanctions from being implemented has been the White House, right? And this is why for Erdogan, this is such an important issue. Now, why was Berman fired? I don't necessarily think it was because of Erdogan. I think it may be that the negative publicity that came about with Bolton's book, where Trump is supposedly said to Erdogan that Berman and company were Obama appointees, and when he gets rid of them, that things will get better. Of course, Berman was a Trump appointee. He doesn't really know much about what's going on, but the fact of the matter is that there is also the worry about Berman going after Giuliani, Trump's personal lawyer, and that may have been more the reason, but also the bad publicity. But I would say the following: initially, the way the White House had planned this, Berman was going to be replaced by an acting person who was close to the U.S. Attorney General William Barr, but that's not happening. So Berman's deputy is taking over, and she is as tough as Berman. So it's unlikely that she's going to buckle down on the White House pressure. So as far as Halkbank and Giuliani are concerned, my guess is the Southern District will continue to do what it's been doing all this time.
Very quickly, I think on the two questions, there's a tremendous amount of speculation, and I don't want to engage in speculation. One thing that I think, picking up on something that Henri alluded to, President Trump likes President Erdogan, and there is a personal relationship there. And I think that one of the ways in which Trump often does business is by, doing people favors. This is, he comes out of the New York real estate world. I'll do you a favor, you're going to do me a favor, you're going to owe me a solid kind of thing, as they say in New York. So there is, of course, that issue. And then I think on Halkbank and the Southern District of New York issue, my sense is that for all of the president's suggestion to Erdogan that he would take care of it, and for all of Attorney General Barr slow rolling it, right now there is a continuance in the case. June 9th, that Judge Berman gave 45 days, but told the lawyers, come back and get ready to set a trial date. This is going to go forward. I think what Erdogan has been representing to the administration is exactly what Henri said. This is the largest sanctions evasion scheme in history, which would require huge fines. That could bring the Turkish banking system to its knees. That's something that Erdogan doesn't need right now, and no one needs. So I know that there's all kinds of speculation about what Erdogan personally was up to. I think we'll just have to wait. I do know that there are journalists who are working on a kind of broader look at Halkbank and where it leads. We'll just have to wait to see what happens.
I will end with the final question to Henri, again on Bolton's book, which seems to be unanswered so far as I know, by James Jeffrey, special representative. There, Bolton is clearly pointing out to Jeffrey as anti-Kurdish, and also the sort of Turkish palaces that Ankara's man, in a way, indicating that. How should we read into this accusation or painting or description of James Jeffrey as such?
Look, I mean, let me put it this way. Jim Jeffries, who was ambassador to Ankara, who has been in charge now for all these months where the Turks have done what they've done in northern Syria, and the fact that he has not been able to convince the Turks to especially for the invasion is one thing, but the kind of behavior Turks and Turkish affiliated groups have engaged in the Kurdish areas, where they've gone after Yazidis, they've gone after Kurds, they've tortured people, they've kicked people out of their houses. I mean, I think the record of Jeffrey is pretty bad in that he hasn't said anything, he hasn't tried to stop them, and this is why there is this perception that Jeffries has been very, very, very pro-Turkish. Look, I don't want to say, hey, somebody's pro-Turkish or anti-Turkish or this or that, but Jeffrey hasn't told me one way or the other. But there is that perception, and that perception I think is real, and I also accept it. I mean, I believe in that perception until something else comes out that Jeffries can show that that I'm wrong. But yes, I mean, there is this perception that Jeffries is doing Turkey's bidding.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. We have almost spoken in an hour, but the complexity of the subjects that we had the tour d'horizon on, we touched upon are very broad and very, very deep. So I thank Stephen Cook, Senior Fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you,
Always
Stephen.
a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
And Henri Barkey, also with the Council on Foreign Relations and teaching international relations at Lehigh University. Thank you, Henri, for joining us. And this was the very, very useful, very informative conversation. Thank you for our analysis. And Ilhan, thank you also for joining us.
It was a great opportunity to be able to ask questions to this heavyweight. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, gents.